Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto Audio Fanfics and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto never returned to the Leaf Village? After failing Sasuke, Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was supposed to be comforting, clean, sterile, safe. Instead, it reminded Naruto of everything he wasn't. Clean conscience. Sterile record of success. Safe haven for those he was supposed to protect. He stared at the ceiling tiles above his hospital bed, counting the hairline cracks that spider-webbed across their surface like the fractures in his own resolve. 47 visible cracks. He'd counted them 6 times now. Anything to avoid looking at the bandages wrapped around his torso or the concerned faces of the medical staff who whispered just outside his hearing range. Whispered. Everything was whispers now. The door creaked open, and Nurse Tanaka entered with her clipboard and forced smile. She'd been avoiding his eyes for 2 days now, ever since he'd been brought in more dead than alive, carried on a stretcher with Sasuke's absence hanging over the entire mission like a funeral shroud. How are we feeling today, Naruto-kun? Her voice held that particular tone adults used when they were trying very hard to be gentle, the same tone they'd used when they told him the Hokage was dead. Fine, he mumbled, though the word tasted like ash. Nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. She made a note on her clipboard, still not meeting his eyes. Your injuries are healing remarkably well. The Nine Tails chakra certainly has its benefits. There it was. The pause. The slight hesitation before the word benefits, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to call the demon sealed inside him a blessing. As if she knew, like everyone else seemed to know, that he was more curse than miracle. When can I leave? Naruto asked, though he wasn't sure where he wanted to go. Back to his empty apartment. Back to the training grounds where Kakashi-sensei would look at him with that expression of barely concealed disappointment. Back to a village that had sent him to retrieve their precious Uchiha, only to return empty-handed and beaten. The Hokage wants to speak with you first, Nurse Tanaka said, finally looking at him directly. When you're feeling strong enough. Strong enough. As if strength had ever been his problem. He'd been strong enough to fight Sasuke at the Valley of the End. Strong enough to take a Chidori through the chest. Strong enough to nearly die trying to bring back someone who didn't want to be saved. But not strong enough to succeed. I'm strong enough now, he said, pushing himself up despite the sharp protest from his ribs. Nurse Tanaka frowned. Naruto-kun, you should rest. I said I'm fine. The words came out harsher than he intended, and she flinched slightly. Another person afraid of him. Another person who saw the demon before they saw the boy. She left without another word, and Naruto was alone again with the silence and the cracks in the ceiling. That's when he heard it, soft as a whisper, warm as honey, and poisonous as a viper's bite. They blame you, Kit. They always have. Naruto's eyes widened. The voice was unmistakable, though he'd never heard it speak so gently before. Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, had always been rage and fury and crushing malice. This was different. This was almost understanding. Kurama, he whispered to the empty room. Who else would speak truth to you when all others offer lies? You gave everything, your blood, your chakra, your very life, and still they whisper of your failure. Naruto's hands clenched into fists, pulling at the IV line taped to his arm. I did fail. Sasuke's gone, and it's my fault. Your fault. There was amusement in the fox's voice now, dark and bitter. Tell me, Kit, whose fault was it that the Uchiha was marked by that snake Orochimaru? Whose fault was it that your sensei taught him techniques that could kill you rather than bonds that could save him? Whose fault was it that this village, your village, allowed him to leave in the first place? But I should have. Should have what? Died. You tried that. I felt your heart stop on that battlefield. I felt your life slip away while you bled for someone who drove a lightning blade through your chest without hesitation. The voice grew softer, more persuasive. And what thanks do you receive? Whispers in hallways. Blame in hospital rooms. The weight of everyone else's failures placed squarely on your shoulders. Naruto wanted to argue, wanted to defend his village, his friends, his sensei. But the words stuck in his throat like swallowed glass. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Kurama's words rang with a terrible truth. He'd been brought back to the village like a broken tool, patched up in secret, visited by no one except medical staff who could barely look at him. Where was Kakashi-sensei? Where were his friends? Where was anyone who might tell him that it wasn't his fault, that he'd done everything he could? The answer was deafening in its silence. Rest now, Kit. Heal your body. But remember, they sent you to bring back their precious Uchiha, and when you couldn't accomplish the impossible, they decided it was easier to blame the demon child than to examine their own failures. The voice faded, leaving Naruto alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The cracks in the ceiling seemed deeper now, more numerous, as if the building itself was reflecting the fractures in his faith. 3 hours later, when Nurse Tanaka returned with his dinner tray, she found him staring out the window at the village below. The setting sun painted everything in shades of red and gold, beautiful and warm, but all Naruto could see were the faces of people who had never wanted him to succeed in the first place. Your friends stopped by earlier, she said quietly, setting the tray on his bedside table. Shikamaru and Choji. They wanted to see you, but visiting hours were over. Naruto didn't respond. Friends. The word felt foreign now, tainted by doubt and Kurama's whispered truths. They asked me to tell you that everyone made it back safe, she continued. All the retrieval team members are recovering well. Everyone except Sasuke. Everyone except the one person the mission was meant to save. That's good, Naruto said, and the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. As night fell over Konoha, Naruto lay awake listening to the sounds of a village settling into peaceful sleep. Somewhere out there, families were gathering for dinner, children were being tucked into bed, and people were living lives unburdened by the weight of impossible expectations and inevitable failure. And somewhere else, much farther away, Sasuke was walking deeper into darkness, following a path that Naruto hadn't been strong enough to pull him from. The failure echoed in his chest like a physical wound, and for the first time since returning to the village, Naruto began to wonder if Kurama might be right. If maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't his strength or his dedication or his willpower. Maybe the problem was that he'd been fighting for people who had never really wanted him to win. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, as sleep finally claimed him in the small hours of the morning, it felt almost like relief. The Hokage's office felt smaller than Naruto remembered, as if the walls had closed in during his 3 days in the hospital. Tsunade sat behind her desk, hands folded, her usual sake nowhere to be seen. That alone told him how serious this conversation was going to be. Sit, she said without looking up from the mission report spread before her. Naruto remained standing. His ribs still ached with every breath, but he wasn't about to show weakness. Not here. Not when he could already feel the weight of disappointment pressing down on him like a physical thing. I said sit, Naruto. Tsunade's voice carried the authority of the Hokage, and despite everything, old habits died hard. He dropped into the chair across from her desk, its leather creaking under his weight. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of shuffling papers and the distant noise of the village going about its daily business. Normal people doing normal things, unburdened by the crushing responsibility of being the supposed hero who couldn't even save his best friend. Finally, Tsunade looked up, and Naruto wished she hadn't. Her brown eyes held a mixture of disappointment, frustration, and something that might have been pity. He wasn't sure which one cut deeper. The mission was a failure, she said without preamble. Sasuke Uchiha has defected to Orochimaru. 3 team members were critically injured. The enemy escaped with their target. She set the report aside and leaned back in her chair. Tell me, Naruto, what part of this outcome resembles success? We all made it back alive, Naruto said quietly. That's something, right, is it? Tsunade's voice was sharp now, cutting. Because from where I sit, it looks like I sent 5 of our most promising young shinobi on what should have been a simple retrieval mission, and they came back broken and empty-handed. Shikamaru is blaming himself for his tactical failures. Choji nearly died from those cursed pills. Neji's injuries will take weeks to heal properly. Kiba's been having nightmares about those sound ninja. Each name felt like a weight added to Naruto's shoulders. His friends, his teammates, all hurt because he hadn't been strong enough to stop Sasuke from leaving in the first place. But you, Tsunade continued, her gaze never wavering from his face, you were the one who was supposed to bring him back. You were the one who knew him best, who had the strongest bond with him. You were the one I trusted to succeed where others might fail. Listen to how she speaks to you, Kit. As if their failures are your burden to bear. Naruto's hands clenched in his lap. Kurama's voice was becoming a constant presence now, a whispered commentary that made every interaction feel like a test he was doomed to fail. I tried, he said, and hated how small his voice sounded. I gave everything I had. Clearly, it wasn't enough. Tsunade stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village she was sworn to protect. Do you understand the position this puts us in? Sasuke was the last loyal Uchiha. His defection isn't just a personal loss, it's a strategic disaster. His Sharingan, his potential, his bloodline, all of it is now in the hands of our enemies. You think I don't know that? The words burst out of Naruto before he could stop them, louder and harsher than he'd intended. You think I don't replay every second of that fight? You think I don't see his face every time I close my eyes? Tsunade turned back to him, eyebrows raised at his outburst. Then you understand why. Why what? Why everyone looks at me like I personally handed Sasuke over to Orochimaru? Why the medical staff whispers about how the demon boy couldn't even save his best friend? Why you're sitting here lecturing me about responsibility when I'm the only one who actually fought him face to face? The silence that followed was deafening. Tsunade's expression shifted from surprise to something colder, more calculating. That's enough, she said quietly. I understand you're upset. Upset? Naruto laughed, and the sound was bitter and wrong coming from him. I'm not upset, Granny Tsunade. I'm tired. I'm tired of being blamed for everyone else's failures. I'm tired of being expected to fix problems I didn't create. And I'm really tired of being treated like a weapon when I succeed and a disappointment when I don't. Yes, Kit, let the truth flow. See how quickly her sympathy turns to suspicion when you stop playing the role of the grateful little soldier. Tsunade's eyes narrowed. You're walking a dangerous line, Naruto. That kind of thinking. What kind of thinking? The kind where I actually examine what happened instead of just accepting blame. Naruto stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Sasuke left because he wanted power. Because he chose revenge over bonds. Because this village couldn't give him what he thought he needed. That's not my failure, that's yours. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. When Tsunade spoke again, Her voice carried the full weight of her authority. Sit down. For a moment, Naruto considered refusing. The rebellious part of him, the part that was growing stronger with each of Kurama's whispered encouragements, wanted to walk out of this office and never look back. But years of conditioning won out, and he sank back into his chair. You're right about one thing, Tsunade said, returning to her seat. This village failed Sasuke. We all did. But that doesn't change the fact that you were his teammate, his closest friend, and you couldn't reach him when it mattered most. That failure is yours to carry, just as the larger failure is mine. So what now? Naruto asked. You want me to apologize for not dying hard enough? Promise to do better next time someone I care about decides to abandon everything we've built together. I want you to learn from this, Tsunade replied. I want you to understand that being a shinobi means accepting responsibility for both success and failure. And right now, I want you to go home, rest, and prepare for your next assignment. Which is border patrol, solo missions. Nothing too demanding. She picked up another scroll from her desk. You're clearly not ready for team leadership responsibilities. The words hit him like a physical blow. Solo missions. Away from teams, away from friends, away from anyone who might depend on him. It was exile disguised as duty, punishment wrapped in the language of necessity. Do you see now, Kit? In their eyes, you are useful only when you succeed, and dangerous when you fail. They speak of responsibility while denying you the chance to prove yourself. They offer punishment disguised as protection. Is that all? Naruto asked, standing again. That's all. Dismissed. He turned to leave, but Tsunade's voice stopped him at the door. Naruto. When he looked back, her expression had softened slightly. I know this is hard. But you're stronger than this. Don't let one failure define you. One failure. As if losing Sasuke was just a single mistake instead of the culmination of everything wrong with his life, his village, and his place in the world. Right, he said. I'll try to remember that. The sun was setting as Naruto walked through the village streets, and everywhere he looked, he saw celebration. Not literal celebration, no festivals or parties, but the quiet satisfaction of people going about their lives without the weight of impossible expectations crushing them into the ground. He passed Ichiraku Ramen, where Tyuki waved at him through the window. The gesture was friendly enough, but Naruto caught the worry in the old man's eyes, the way he glanced around to see who might be watching him acknowledge the demon container. He passed the training grounds where he'd spent countless hours with Team 7, learning to work together, building bonds that were supposed to last forever. A group of academy students was practicing there now, their instructor calling out corrections and encouragement. When they noticed Naruto, their voices dropped to whispers. Is that him? The one who couldn't bring back the Uchiha? My dad says he's dangerous. Their instructor quickly herded them away, shooting Naruto an apologetic look that somehow made everything worse. Even the children knew he was a failure. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun had fully set, and Naruto felt hollow inside. Empty. As if something essential had been carved out of him during that meeting with Tsunade. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he sat on his bed in the darkness, staring at the photographs scattered across his dresser. Pictures of Team 7 during happier times. Pictures of him and Sasuke sparring, arguing, learning to be a team. Pictures of a friendship that had meant everything to him and apparently nothing to the person it was supposed to bind. Look at those images, Kit. Look at how happy you were, how trusting. And where did that trust lead you? Shut up, Naruto whispered, but there was no heat in it. You gave everything for them, and what did you receive? Scorn. Blame. Exile disguised as solo missions. They'll use you when they need a weapon and discard you when you prove inconveniently human. That's not. They're not like that. Aren't they? Tell me, when was the last time someone thanked you for what you sacrificed? When was the last time someone asked how you were handling Sasuke's betrayal instead of demanding to know why you failed to prevent it? Naruto couldn't answer because there was no answer. No one had asked how he was doing. No one had acknowledged that losing Sasuke was his loss too, his grief too, his heart breaking alongside everyone else's. They expect you to be their perfect soldier, unbreaking, unquestioning, always ready to bleed for their cause. But the moment you show weakness, the moment you fail to meet their impossible standards, you become the problem to be managed rather than the person to be supported. Without thinking, Naruto found himself standing, moving to his closet. He pulled out his gear, kunai, shuriken, his headband. If Tsunade wanted him to train alone, he'd train alone. He'd push himself until his body gave out, until the physical exhaustion drowned out the voice in his head that was making too much sense. The training ground he chose was isolated, far from the main areas where other ninja practiced. He'd discovered it months ago during one of his solo training sessions, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees that muffled sound and hid him from curious eyes. Perfect for someone who was no longer welcome in the spaces where real teams trained together. He started with basic kata, working through forms that Kakashi had taught him. But every movement reminded him of lessons shared with Sasuke, of competitions and camaraderie and the easy friendship that had made everything else bearable. Soon, basic forms weren't enough. He moved to jutsu practice, pushing chakra through techniques with more force than necessary, letting the burn of overexertion replace the ache in his chest. Shadow Clone Jutsu, Rasengan. Every technique in his arsenal, practiced with increasing desperation as the night wore on. Sweat soaked through his clothes, his muscles screamed in protest, and still he pushed harder. Yes, Kit, feed that anger. Let it burn away the weakness they've tried to instill in you. You are powerful, more powerful than any of them realize. Why should you limit yourself for their comfort? Hours passed. The moon climbed high overhead, and still Naruto trained, his movements becoming sloppy with exhaustion but never stopping. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, he'd have to think about Tsunade's disappointment, about his friend's injuries, about Sasuke's face as he walked away into darkness. If he stopped, he'd have to acknowledge that everything he'd believed about bonds and friendship and belonging might be nothing more than comforting lies he'd told himself to make the loneliness bearable. Dawn was breaking when he finally collapsed, falling to his knees in the churned-up dirt of the training ground. His vision blurred with exhaustion, his lungs burning, his entire body shaking from overexertion. But the voice in his head was clearer than ever. Look at you, Kit. Magnificent in your strength, terrible in your dedication. And they want to waste you on solo missions and border patrols. They want to hide your light under a bushel because it threatens their small, ordered world. Naruto pressed his forehead to the ground, tasting dirt and sweat and the bitter flavor of growing disillusion. You gave everything for them, and what did you receive? Scorn. This time, he didn't argue. Kakashi Hatake had never considered himself a particularly good teacher. This wasn't false modesty or self-deprecation, it was a cold assessment of facts. Good teachers inspired their students, guided them toward growth, and helped them navigate the complexities of both technique and philosophy. Good teachers built bonds that lasted beyond the classroom. Kakashi had failed to save either of his students. He stood on the roof of his apartment building in the pre-dawn darkness, looking out over the village he'd sworn to protect. Somewhere in those winding streets, Naruto was probably still training himself to exhaustion. The boy had been doing it every night since his release from the hospital, pushing his body past reasonable limits in isolated training grounds where he thought no one would notice. Kakashi noticed. He'd been watching from the shadows, Too much of a coward to approach directly, too consumed by guilt to know what he'd say if he did. I failed you both, he thought, and the words felt like glass in his throat. I taught Sasuke techniques that made him more dangerous without teaching him the wisdom to use them responsibly. I focused on your natural talent, Naruto, without addressing the emotional wounds that made you so desperate for acknowledgement. The worst part was the timing. If he'd intervened earlier, if he'd recognized the signs of Sasuke's growing darkness, if he'd been the teacher they'd needed instead of the distant mentor he'd chosen to be. But, if, was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when one student was walking deeper into Orochimaru's web with every passing day, and the other was slowly drowning in a village that expected him to be their perfect weapon without offering him the support he needed to maintain his humanity. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Kakashi wasn't expecting visitors. Few people knew where he lived, and fewer still would visit at this hour. He dropped silently from the roof to his apartment, landing on the balcony and slipping through the sliding door. Another knock, more insistent this time. Kakashi-sensei. The voice was muffled but unmistakable. Naruto. For a moment, Kakashi hesitated. He'd been trying to work up the courage to approach his remaining student for days, but now that Naruto had come to him, he felt completely unprepared. What did you say to someone you'd failed so completely? How did you begin to bridge a gap that felt like an ocean? He opened the door. Naruto looked terrible. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat, his hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much self-punishment. But it was his expression that made Kakashi's chest tighten. Gone was the bright enthusiasm that had defined the boy since the day they'd met. In its place was something harder, more guarded, as if he'd built walls where there used to be open doors. Naruto, Kakashi said, stepping aside to let him in. This is unexpected. Yeah, well, Naruto entered the apartment but didn't sit, standing near the door as if ready to bolt at any moment. I wanted to ask you something. Of course. What is it? Naruto was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his blue eyes held an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. Why didn't you teach me the Chidori? The question hit Kakashi like a physical blow. He'd been expecting anger about the mission's failure, or questions about what they should do next, or even accusations about his shortcomings as a teacher. He hadn't expected this. Naruto, you taught it to Sasuke. You spent weeks working with him, perfecting his technique, making him stronger. But you never offered to teach it to me. Naruto's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that made Kakashi's instincts prickle. Was it because I wasn't good enough? Because I didn't have the Sharingan to copy it perfectly? It wasn't about worthiness, Kakashi said carefully. The Chidori requires speed, precision, the ability to see your opponent's movements clearly. Naruto nodded. I know. Sasuke explained it to me right before he tried to put it through my chest. The casual way he said it, as if discussing the weather rather than a near-death experience, was more disturbing than any emotional outburst would have been. The technique wasn't right for your fighting style, Kakashi explained, though the words felt inadequate. Your strength has always been in your unpredictability, your chakra reserves, your ability to outlast opponents through sheer determination. The Chidori is a precision weapon. A precision weapon that you gave to someone who was already walking away from us, Naruto interrupted. Tell me, Kakashi-sensei, when you were teaching Sasuke to kill with lightning, did you ever think about what would happen if he decided we were his enemies? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Because the horrible truth was that Kakashi had thought about it, in the dark corners of his mind that he tried not to examine too closely. He'd seen the signs of Sasuke's growing isolation, his increasing obsession with power, his willingness to harm teammates in pursuit of his goals. And he'd chosen to ignore those signs in favor of focusing on technique and strength. I thought I could reach him, Kakashi said quietly. I thought that by helping him become stronger, I could give him the tools to overcome his darkness. And what about me? Naruto asked. What tools did you give me to overcome mine? You don't have darkness, Naruto. Don't. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Don't you dare tell me I don't have darkness. I have a demon sealed inside me that whispers about power and revenge every time I close my eyes. I have a village that sees me as a weapon first and a person second. I have teammates who blame me for their failures and a sensei who, he stopped himself, but the damage was already done. A sensei who what? Kakashi asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was almost too soft to hear. A sensei who taught his star pupil how to kill but never taught his problem student how to live. The words hit harder than any jutsu Kakashi had ever faced. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't that simple, but the explanations died in his throat because maybe it really was that simple. He'd spent months teaching Sasuke advanced techniques while leaving Naruto to figure out basic chakra control on his own. He'd focused on Sasuke's tactical development while dismissing Naruto's emotional needs as something the boy would eventually grow out of. He'd poured his energy into saving the student who seemed destined for greatness while taking for granted the one who seemed too resilient to break. Do you see now, Kit? Even he cannot deny the truth of what you've observed. Naruto's hand went to his stomach for a moment, and something flickered across his expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. But it was gone so quickly that Kakashi almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Naruto, he said, reaching out tentatively. I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes? Naruto laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to call it mistakes? Fine. Let's talk about mistakes. Your mistake was treating us like we were both destined for the same path when we clearly needed different things. Your mistake was prioritizing power over people. Your mistake was assuming that natural talent was more important than emotional stability. Each word was precise, calculated, nothing like the rambling speeches Naruto was known for. It was as if someone else was speaking through him, someone older, more cynical, more aware of the world's fundamental unfairness. But the biggest mistake, Naruto continued, was thinking that you could fix everything with technique and training. Some problems can't be solved with more jutsu, Kakashi-sensei. Some problems require actually caring about the person, not just the soldier. I do care about you, Kakashi said, and the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Both of you. Everything I did was because I cared. Really? Then why did you never ask me how I was handling the villagers' hatred? Why did you never check to see if I was okay after missions where I had to use the Nine Tails chakra? Why did you never once acknowledge that being a Jinchuriki might come with challenges that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness? Kakashi opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Because Naruto was right. He treated the Nine Tails as a resource to be managed rather than a burden to be understood. He'd focused on helping Naruto control the fox's power without ever considering what it might cost him emotionally. I'm sorry, he said finally, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. Naruto studied him for a moment, and there was something in his expression that Kakashi had never seen before, pity, maybe, or disappointment so deep it had calcified into indifference. Yeah, Naruto said quietly. I figured you would be. He turned to leave, but Kakashi caught his arm. Wait, let me make this right. Let me be the teacher you needed. It's too late for that. Naruto pulled free gently, not with anger but with the calm certainty of someone who had already made their peace with disappointment. You can't undo years of neglect with good intentions, and you can't fix fundamental problems with last-minute attention. Then what do you want from me? Naruto paused at the door, his hand on the handle. I want you to leave me alone, he said without turning around. I want you to stop following me to training grounds and watching me from rooftops like I'm some kind of flight risk. I want you to accept that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that your students were broken, maybe the problem is that you never bothered to learn how to fix what was wrong with them. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Kakashi alone with his guilt and the growing certainty that he'd just lost his second student in as many weeks. From his position on a rooftop 3 buildings away, a figure in a dark cloak observed the blonde boy's departure from the Hitaki residence. The conversation had been too distant to overhear, but body language spoke volumes. The tension, the obvious conflict, the way the boy had left without the reconciliation his teacher had clearly been hoping for. Interesting. The figure made a few quick hand signs, and a raven materialized from shadows. A brief message was attached to its leg, just a few words, but enough to convey the essential information. Subject shows increasing isolation from support structure. Emotional bonds weakening. Recommend continued observation. The raven took flight, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness with its report. Soon, it would reach its destination, and the message would be passed up the chain of command to those who understood the value of a powerful young shinobi with nowhere else to turn. But that was for others to decide. For now, the observer simply watched as Naruto Uzumaki walked alone through empty streets, his shoulders set in a line that spoke of resolve rather than defeat. The boy was changing. The question was whether that change would serve their purposes or require intervention. Either way, he would be watched. The child of prophecy was too valuable to lose to the whims of village politics and failed mentorship. Far too valuable. Back in his apartment, Kakashi stood at his window and watched Naruto disappear into the maze of Konoha streets. The boy moved differently now, more purposefully, with less of the bouncing energy that had once made him impossible to ignore. Even his posture had changed, becoming more closed off, more defensive. More like someone who expected the world to disappoint him. I did this, Kakashi thought, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. I broke him as surely as if I'd used a jutsu designed for that purpose. The worst part was that he could see the path forward from here. Naruto would continue to isolate himself, pushing away anyone who tried to help. He'd throw himself into training with increasing desperation, seeking in physical exhaustion what he could no longer find in human connection. He'd grow stronger, yes, but also colder, more bitter, more likely to make the same mistakes that had claimed so many promising shinobi before him. And Kakashi, paralyzed by guilt and uncertainty, would watch it happen while telling himself there was nothing he could do to stop it. Just like he'd watched Sasuke walk away. Just like he'd failed his own sensei all those years ago. Some patterns, it seemed, were destined to repeat themselves no matter how much you wanted to break free. Outside, the sun was rising over Konoha, painting the buildings in shades of gold and orange that should have been beautiful. Instead, all Kakashi could see was the shadow his failure had cast across his student's future, a shadow that was growing longer and darker with each passing day. And somewhere in that shadow, he was certain, something was waiting to take advantage of a lonely boy's pain. The mission was supposed to be simple: escort a merchant caravan to a border town, ensure their safety, collect payment, return home. Standard C-rank work that barely required a genin, let alone someone with Naruto's capabilities. But Tsunade had been clear: solo missions only, nothing too demanding, prove you can handle responsibility on a smaller scale before being trusted with anything important. It was punishment disguised as duty, and they both knew it. Naruto crouched on a tree branch overlooking the winding mountain road, watching the caravan make its slow progress toward their destination. 3 wagons loaded with goods, a dozen civilians including women and children, and exactly 1 ninja for protection. The merchant leader, Yamamoto, had made his displeasure clear from the moment he'd seen Naruto at the village gates. "This is who they send us. A boy." The man's weathered face had twisted with disgust. "We requested proper protection, not some academy student playing ninja. I'm qualified for C-rank missions," Naruto had replied, keeping his voice level despite the familiar sting of dismissal. "Qualified?" Yamamoto had looked him up and down with obvious skepticism. "You look like you should be in school, not protecting valuable cargo." If only that had been the worst of it. Now, 3 days into their journey, Naruto had proven his worth multiple times. He'd scared off a pack of wolves with a simple show of chakra. He'd detected and disabled 3 separate bandit ambushes before they could materialize into real threats. He'd even used his shadow clones to help repair a broken wagon wheel, turning what could have been a day-long delay into a mere hour's inconvenience. And still, the whispers followed him. "Do you hear them, Kit? Even now, when you've proven your value beyond question, they speak of you as if you were the threat rather than their salvation." Kurama's voice had become a constant presence, offering commentary on every interaction, every sideways glance, every hushed conversation that stopped when he drew near. The fox was right, of course. Despite everything he'd done to protect them, the caravan members still watched him with barely concealed fear and suspicion. Movement in the forest caught his attention. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he spotted figures moving through the trees parallel to the road, too many to be animals, too coordinated to be random travelers. His hand went to his kunai pouch as he counted them. 8, maybe 9 bandits, positioning themselves for an ambush at the narrow pass ahead. This was different from the previous attempts. Those had been opportunistic attacks by small groups hoping for easy prey. This looked organized, planned, with enough numbers to pose a real threat to the caravan. Naruto dropped silently from his perch and made his way back to the wagons. The lead merchant was riding at the front, occasionally barking orders at the drivers or complaining about the pace. "Yamamoto-san," Naruto called softly, falling into step beside the man's horse. "We have a problem." The merchant's face soured at the sound of Naruto's voice. "What now, boy? More of your paranoid fantasies about bandits in every shadow. There are at least 8 hostiles positioned for an ambush in the pass ahead. I need you to halt the caravan while I deal with them." "Deal with them?" Yamamoto snorted. "You're 1 child against 8 grown men. Even if your ridiculous story is true, what exactly do you plan to do?" Naruto felt his patience fraying. "My job. Just keep everyone here until I give the all clear." He turned to leave, but Yamamoto's voice stopped him. "Wait. If there really are bandits ahead, shouldn't we turn back? Find another route. This is the only viable path to your destination, and turning back would add 3 days to the journey." "I can handle 8 bandits. You're insane if you think." "I'm a ninja," Naruto said flatly. "This is what I do." The ambush site was perfectly chosen, a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides, limiting escape routes and forcing travelers into a killing field. The bandits had positioned themselves well, with archers on the high ground and spearmen blocking the road ahead. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a death trap for any caravan. Unfortunately for them, Naruto was anything but normal circumstances. He studied their positions from concealment, counting weapons and assessing threat levels. These weren't desperate thieves looking for a quick score, they were organized, well-equipped, and clearly experienced in this type of operation. Their leader, a scarred man with a massive 2-handed sword, was barking quiet orders to his subordinates with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Professional bandits. Probably the remnants of a disbanded mercenary unit or missing nin who'd turned to highway robbery when more legitimate work dried up. Which meant they were dangerous enough to kill civilians without hesitation, but not quite skilled enough to pose a serious threat to a Konoha ninja. Crush them, Kit. Show them what real power looks like. Make them regret the day they decided to prey on those under your protection. Naruto made the hand sign for Shadow Clone Jutsu, creating a dozen copies of himself. The clones scattered to different positions around the canyon, moving with the silent efficiency he'd developed through years of solo training. The attack came from all sides at once. The first bandit died without ever seeing what killed him, a kunai to the throat from a clone that materialized behind his position. The second managed a scream before another clone's Rasengan turned his chest into a crater. The archers on the canyon walls found themselves under assault from multiple angles as clones bounded up the stone faces with chakra-enhanced speed. It was over in less than 3 minutes. When the dust settled, 8 bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor. The leader, the scarred man with the two-handed sword, was still alive but only barely. Naruto had deliberately held back the killing blow, leaving him pinned to a tree with kunai through both shoulders. Please, the man gasped, blood running down his chin. We weren't going to kill anyone. Just rob them and let them go. Naruto studied him dispassionately. You had poison on your arrowheads. Killing blades, not sleeping darts. Don't lie to me. The bandit's eyes widened in surprise, then fear. How did you? I can smell it. It was true. One of the many benefits of his connection to Kurama was enhanced senses that made such deceptions obvious. You were planning to murder every person in that caravan, probably after taking whatever you wanted from them first. We were desperate. Times have been hard. Times are hard for everyone. Naruto pulled out another kunai, testing its weight. That doesn't give you the right to prey on innocent people. Wait, I can give you information. Other bandit groups, hidden caches of stolen goods, anything you want. Naruto considered this for a moment, then shook his head. The only thing I want is for people like you to stop making the world more dangerous for everyone else. The final kunai took the bandit leader in the heart, ending his pleas mid-sentence. Efficient. Ruthless. This is what strength looks like, Kit. Not the bumbling heroics they taught you in that academy, but the practical application of power in service of a goal. Naruto looked around at the carnage he'd created, 8 bodies scattered like broken dolls, blood pooling in the dust, the scent of death hanging heavy in the air. A year ago, the sight would have made him sick. Now, he felt nothing but grim satisfaction. They'd threatened innocent people. They'd chosen to be predators. This was what happened to predators when they encountered something higher up the food chain. The caravan's reaction when he returned was everything he'd expected and nothing he'd hoped for. Dear gods, whispered one of the merchants, staring at the blood spattered across Naruto's clothes. What did you do? Dealt with the bandits, Naruto replied simply. The pass is clear now. You killed them. This from Yamamoto, his face pale with shock. They were going to kill you. All of you. Naruto gestured toward the canyon ahead. Poisoned weapons, planned execution, robbery is an afterthought. This was the only way to ensure your safety. But you're just a boy, stammered one of the women. How could you? Listen to them, Kit. You saved their lives, protected their families, eliminated a threat that would have plagued other travelers for months or years to come. And their reaction is horror that you were capable of doing what needed to be done. Naruto watched their faces, the fear, the revulsion, the way they unconsciously stepped back from him as if he were the dangerous one. These people, whose lives he'd just saved, were looking at him like he was a monster. Maybe he was. The road ahead is safe, he said quietly. We can reach the border town by evening if we don't delay. The remainder of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence. The merchants and their families spoke in hushed whispers when they thought he wasn't listening, and the children who had been friendly during the early days of travel now hid behind their parents whenever he approached. Did you see how easily he killed them? 8 men, and he didn't even get hurt. What kind of training produces that sort of efficiency? I heard he has a demon inside him. Maybe that explains. Shish. He might hear you. By the time they reached their destination, Naruto felt like a plague carrier escorting a group of terrified refugees. The border town's gates were a welcome sight, not because they marked the completion of his mission, but because they represented the end of his current torment. The mission payment was completed in uncomfortable silence. Yamamoto handed over the agreed-upon fee without meeting Naruto's eyes, as if afraid that direct eye contact might somehow contaminate him. Thank you for your service, the merchant said stiffly. I'll be sure to mention your effectiveness in my report to the Hokage. Effectiveness. Not heroism, not protection, not going above and beyond to ensure their safety. Effectiveness, as if he were a particularly sharp tool rather than a person who'd risked his life for their benefit. Do you see now, Kit? They will never accept you. You are their weapon, not their hero. No matter how many lives you save, how many threats you eliminate, how much you sacrifice for their sake, you will always be the monster they tolerate rather than the guardian they celebrate. As Naruto began the long journey back to Konoha alone, Kurama's words echoed in his mind with the weight of undeniable truth. He'd completed a perfect mission, no civilian casualties, threat eliminated, objectives achieved. And his reward was to be treated like a dangerous animal that had performed its trick adequately. The sun was setting when he stopped at a roadside inn for the night. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes, took one look at his blood-stained clothes and the hollowness in his expression and offered him a room without questions. It was the first genuine kindness he'd encountered in days. Rough mission? She asked as she led him upstairs. Something like that. Well, you're safe here. Hot meal, clean bed, and no one will bother you with questions you don't want to answer. Her simple acceptance, the way she treated him as just another tired traveler rather than a potential threat, almost broke something inside him. This stranger showed him more consideration in 5 minutes than the people he'd risked his life to protect had managed in an entire week. That night, as he lay in a bed that smelled of lavender and listened to the sound of normal people living normal lives in the rooms around him, Naruto made a decision that would have terrified him a month earlier. He stopped caring what they thought of him. If they wanted to see him as a weapon rather than a person, fine. If they wanted to fear his effectiveness while benefiting from his protection, so be it. If they could only accept his service while rejecting his humanity, then perhaps it was time to stop offering his humanity for their consideration. Wisdom at last, Kit. You are learning what I learned long ago. The only relationship that matters is the one between predator and prey. Everything else is just pretty words meant to disguise the fundamental truth of power. For the first time since the fox had started speaking to him, Naruto didn't argue with its assessment. Unknown to Naruto, his mentor Jiraiya had arrived in Konoha that very evening, having completed a particularly grueling intelligence-gathering mission on the borders of Rain Country. The Toad Sage was tired, dirty, and looking forward to a hot bath and a bottle of sake, roughly in that order. He was also completely unaware of his student's growing crisis. Jiraiya-sama, Tsunade's assistant, appeared at his elbow almost before he'd cleared the village gates. The Hokage requests your immediate presence. She says it's urgent. Jiraiya suppressed a groan. Urgent usually meant either a new threat to the village's security or political complications that required his particular skill set to navigate. Either way, It meant his bath and sake would have to wait. What's the situation? He asked as they made their way through the village streets. Intelligence reports from our border stations. Increased Akatsuki activity, possible movements against other Jinchuriki villages. The Hokage wants your assessment of the threat level. Akatsuki. Jiraiya's expression darkened. He'd been tracking the organization's movements for months, trying to understand their ultimate goals and capabilities. If they were accelerating their timeline. Any word on specific targets? Preliminary reports suggest they may be moving against the Sand Village next. The one-tailed Jinchuriki. Gaara. Jiraiya picked up the pace. If Akatsuki was targeting Gaara, it meant they were moving into the active phase of their plan. Which meant Naruto would be a target soon enough, if he wasn't already. His mind was so focused on the larger strategic implications that he completely missed the smaller crisis playing out in his student's heart. The reports of solo missions in isolation, the concerned whispers from hospital staff, the way certain merchants had described their ninja escort as effective but disturbing, all of it passed by his awareness like background noise. After all, Naruto was strong. Naruto was resilient. Naruto could handle a few difficult missions while the adults dealt with the real threats. It was exactly the kind of assumption that had already cost Konoha one promising student. And as the night deepened around the village, with Jiraiya locked in strategic planning sessions and Naruto lying awake in a roadside inn questioning everything he'd ever believed about heroism and sacrifice, the distance between teacher and student grew just a little bit wider. Just wide enough for something else to slip through the gap. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. Naruto found himself standing in a place that felt familiar yet wrong, the streets of Konoha, but empty of people and draped in perpetual twilight. The buildings were the right shape, the roads followed the correct paths, but everything was rendered in shades of gray and shadow, as if the color had been drained from the world. He walked through the deserted village, his footsteps echoing strangely in the silence. No shopkeepers calling out their wares, no children playing in the streets, no ninja leaping across rooftops on their way to missions. Just emptiness, stretching in every direction. Lonely, isn't it? Naruto spun toward the voice, his hand instinctively reaching for a kunai that wasn't there. Standing beneath a flickering streetlight was a figure in a black cloak marked with red clouds, tall, pale, with long dark hair framing features that were both beautiful and terrible. Itachi Uchiha. You? Naruto breathed, his heart racing. What are you doing here? This is a dream, Itachi said calmly, stepping forward into the light. His red Sharingan eyes seemed to glow in the gray twilight. Your dream, to be precise. I'm merely visiting. Naruto tensed, preparing to fight, but something felt off. His chakra felt sluggish, distant, as if he were trying to access it through thick glass. Even his body felt strange, present but not quite real, like a reflection in water. The fox's voice, when it came, was oddly subdued. Interesting. The Uchiha has skill, I'll give him that. What do you want? Naruto demanded, though his voice sounded hollow in the empty air. To talk. Itachi's expression was unreadable, neither threatening nor reassuring. Nothing more. In dreams, we can speak without the complications of the waking world, no villages to defend, no loyalties to consider, no expectations to meet. I'm not telling you anything about Konoha's defenses. I'm not asking about them. Itachi began walking, his movements fluid and unhurried. Tell me, Naruto Uzumaki, when did you last feel truly welcomed in your village? The question hit harder than any physical attack could have. Naruto found himself walking alongside the missing nin, though he couldn't remember deciding to do so. It's not like that, he said, but the words felt weak even to his own ears. Isn't it? Itachi glanced at him sideways. When you return from missions, do they celebrate your success or simply expect it? When you're injured in service to the village, do they tend to your wounds with gratitude or clinical detachment? When you save their lives, do they thank you or fear what you might do next? Each question was a knife twisted in an already bleeding wound. Because the terrible truth was that Naruto couldn't remember the last time someone had genuinely thanked him for his service, the last time his success had been celebrated rather than simply acknowledged as expected, the last time anyone had looked at him with gratitude instead of wariness. They're just scared, Naruto said weakly. The Nine Tails. The Nine Tails is part of you, not the whole of you. Itachi stopped walking and turned to face him directly. But they choose to see only the fox, don't they? The weapon they can deploy when convenient, the threat they must tolerate when not. He speaks truth, Kit. More truth than your so-called friends have offered in years. Kurama's voice held an odd note of approval. Listen to what he says. There is wisdom in his words. Why are you telling me this? Naruto asked. What's in it for you? Perhaps I simply recognize a kindred spirit. Itachi resumed walking, leading them toward what looked like the academy building. Do you know what it's like to be branded a traitor by people who never understood your true loyalty? To have your every action interpreted through the lens of their fear rather than your intent. You murdered your entire clan, Naruto said, but there was less heat in the accusation than there should have been. Did I? Itachi's smile was enigmatic, neither confirming nor denying. Or did I do what was necessary to prevent a greater tragedy? The difference between those two interpretations often comes down to perspective, and whose version of events you choose to believe. They had reached the academy now, its familiar facade rendered strange and ominous in the dream light. Itachi gestured toward the building where Naruto had spent some of his most painful early years. Tell me about this place, he said. What do you remember most clearly? Without thinking, Naruto found himself answering. Being alone. Sitting by myself while everyone else had friends to talk to, groups to belong to. The teachers who looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a student to be taught. And how did that make you feel? Angry. Sad. Like I was broken somehow, like there was something fundamentally wrong with me that everyone else could see but I couldn't understand. Itachi nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. And now, years later, with all your strength and accomplishments, how do people look at you? The answer came without conscious thought, the same way. Yes. Itachi's voice was almost gentle now. Because they never saw you as a person to begin with. You were always just a repository for their fears and expectations. A convenient solution to their problems when you succeeded, a dangerous liability when you failed. He understands, Kit. He sees what I have been trying to show you, that their acceptance was never real, their bonds were never true. They used you. But that's not. Naruto struggled to find words to refute what felt increasingly like truth. There are people who care about me. My teammates, my sensei. Your teammates who blame you for Sasuke's defection. Your sensei who taught your rival deadly techniques while leaving you to develop your own skills through trial and error. Itachi's questions were surgical in their precision. Tell me, when Sasuke chose to leave the village, who was held responsible? When the mission to retrieve him failed, who bore the burden of that failure? The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications Naruto didn't want to examine. You carry the weight of everyone else's shortcomings, Itachi continued. Their failures become your failures. Their fears become your isolation. Their limitations become your cage. They were walking through the academy halls now, past empty classrooms and silent corridors. In one room, Naruto could see ghostly images of his younger self, alone at a desk, ignored by teachers, mocked by classmates. I used to think things would get better, he said quietly, not sure why he was sharing this with someone who should be his enemy. I thought if I just got stronger, if I proved myself enough times, eventually they'd see me differently. And have they? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because the answer Naruto had been trying not to think about for weeks, was no. If anything, his growing strength seemed to make people more afraid of him, not less. Strength without acceptance is just another form of imprisonment, Itachi observed. They keep you close enough to use your power, but far enough away to avoid confronting their own hypocrisy. Listen to him, Kit. He speaks of realities that your village mentors would never acknowledge. There is liberation in truth, even painful truth. What are you suggesting? Naruto asked, though part of him already knew. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply observing that you have choices they would prefer you never realize you possess. Itachi stopped beside a window that looked out over the dream version of Konoha. You could leave. You could find people who value strength over sentiment, results over rhetoric. You could discover what it means to be appreciated for what you are rather than tolerated for what you represent. Leave Konoha. The idea should have been unthinkable, but it wasn't. Over the past weeks, the thought had crossed his mind more than once, usually in the dark hours after particularly painful encounters with the village's judgment. Why not? What has your loyalty earned you? What has your sacrifice accomplished? What has your dedication brought you besides more expectations and greater isolation? Each question was a blow to foundations that were already cracking. Because when Naruto tried to think of reasons to stay, to continue fighting for people who seemed determined to see him as a weapon rather than a person, the list felt disturbingly short. There are people who need me, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Are there? Or are there people who need your power while remaining fundamentally uninterested in your well-being? Itachi turned from the window to look at him directly. The distinction matters, Naruto. One relationship is based on mutual respect. The other is simply exploitation dressed in prettier language. The dream village around them began to shift and blur, as if their conversation was reaching its natural conclusion. But Itachi's words remained crystal clear, each one etching itself into Naruto's consciousness with the weight of revelation. Think carefully about what you truly owe to people who have never truly accepted you, the Uchiha said, his form beginning to fade. And remember, there are others in this world who understand what it means to be cast aside by those who should have protected you. Others who value strength and loyalty over politics and fear. Wait, Naruto called out as the dream dissolved around them. What do you mean? Who are you talking about? But Itachi was already gone, and the gray twilight was giving way to deeper darkness. Interesting visitor, Kit. Very interesting indeed. You knew he was here. Naruto's mental voice was sharp with accusation. Why didn't you warn me? Warn you? Why would I warn you away from someone speaking sense for the first time in months? His words carry truth, even if his motives remain unclear. He's a criminal. A missing nin. So was I, in their eyes. So are all those who refuse to bow to the arbitrary authority of village elders and political structures. Perhaps the question isn't why someone like him would reach out to you, but why it took so long for anyone to do so. The fox's words followed Naruto into true sleep, where dreams gave way to deeper rest but no real peace. He woke in his roadside inn room with the taste of revelation bitter on his tongue. Dawn light was creeping through the shuttered windows, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the darkness that had taken root in his thoughts. The dream felt more real than the waking world, more honest, more direct, more willing to confront truths that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Itachi's questions echoed in his mind with the persistence of actual memories, each one forcing him to examine assumptions he'd never thought to question. What has your loyalty earned you? What has your sacrifice accomplished? What has your dedication brought you besides more expectations and greater isolation? Naruto sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his head in his hands, and tried to find answers that didn't sound hollow. He thought of all the missions completed, all the threats eliminated, all the people saved. But when he tried to balance that against gratitude received, genuine acceptance earned, or authentic friendships forged, the scales tipped in a direction that made his chest tight with something dangerously close to despair. Had it always been this one-sided? Or was he only now seeing clearly for the first time? The innkeeper knocked softly on his door, interrupting his brooding. "Breakfast is ready if you'd like some, young man. No charge. You look like you could use a good meal." Her kindness was genuine, uncomplicated by fear or expectation. She wanted nothing from him except perhaps his company at her table, and even that was offered freely rather than demanded. It was the sort of simple human consideration that should have been commonplace but felt precious in its rarity. "Thank you," he called back. "I'll be down in a moment." As he gathered his gear and prepared to continue his journey back to Konoha, Naruto caught sight of his reflection in the room's small mirror. The face looking back at him was older than it should have been, marked by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. But it was the eyes that gave him pause, still blue, still bright, but holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. The eyes of someone who was learning not to trust too easily, not to hope too freely, not to give too much of themselves to people who might not value what they received. Change is natural, Kit. Growth requires the shedding of old illusions and the acceptance of harder truths. The boy who left on this mission is not the same as the one who will return. For once, Naruto didn't argue with the fox's observation. Because it was true, something fundamental had shifted inside him over the past few weeks. The unshakable faith in his village, his friends, his place in the world had developed cracks that were spreading with each new disappointment. And maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it was time to stop defining himself by other people's expectations and start considering what he actually wanted from his life. Maybe it was time to stop accepting crumbs of acknowledgement as if they were feast, and start demanding the respect his achievements had earned. Maybe it was time to consider that there might be other paths to the peace and belonging he'd always sought, paths that didn't require him to constantly prove his worth to people who seemed determined to withhold their acceptance no matter what he accomplished. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he made his way downstairs to share breakfast with a kind stranger who asked nothing of him except his company, it felt almost like freedom. Naruto had been back in Konoha for exactly 4 hours when Jiraiya found him. He was sitting on the swings at the old academy playground, the same swings where he'd spent countless lonely afternoons as a child, watching other kids laugh and play while he remained on the periphery. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even as a teenager who'd saved the village multiple times, he still ended up in the same place, still on the outside looking in. "There you are," Jiraiya's voice boomed across the empty playground. "I've been looking everywhere for you, kid." Naruto didn't turn around, didn't get up from the swing, didn't show any of the enthusiasm that usually accompanied his mentor's arrival. He just sat there, gently rocking back and forth, watching the sun set through the tree branches. "Hey," Jiraiya said again, his tone shifting from boisterous to concerned as he approached. "Rough mission. Completed successfully," Naruto replied without inflection. "Objective achieved, civilians protected, hostiles eliminated. The merchants will reach their destination safely and with all their goods intact." The clinical way he reported it made Jiraiya pause. This wasn't how Naruto usually described his missions. There were no animated gestures, no excited rambling about techniques he'd used or people he'd helped. Just facts, delivered with the emotional investment of someone reading a weather report. "That's good," Jiraiya said carefully, settling onto the swing beside his student. But I wasn't asking about the mission results. I was asking how you're doing. I'm fine. The words came out flat, automatic, the kind of response that ended conversations rather than encouraged them. Jiraiya studied his student's profile in the dying light. Naruto looked older somehow, as if the few days away had aged him months. There was a set to his shoulders, a hardness around his eyes, that spoke of experiences that had cut deeper than simple physical challenges. Tsunade told me about what happened with Sasuke, Jiraiya said quietly. About the mission, the failure. I know that must be eating at you. Here it comes, Kit. Another adult ready to tell you how to feel about your pain, how to process your loss, how to be the person they need you to be rather than the person you are. Naruto's grip tightened on the swing's chains. Do you really know? I know what it's like to lose someone important. To feel responsible for their choices. Jiraiya's voice carried the weight of old regrets. I know what it's like to wonder if you could have done something different, said something different, been something different that might have changed the outcome. And what did you conclude? Naruto asked, finally turning to look at his mentor. When you were wondering all those things. Jiraiya was quiet for a long moment. That some people are determined to walk their own path, no matter how much we care about them or how hard we try to save them. That sometimes the best thing you can do is let them go and focus on the people you can still help. Is that what you did? Let them go. The question hit harder than Jiraiya had expected. Because the honest answer was no, he'd spent years chasing after his own lost students, trying to find some way to bring them back to the light. Orochimaru, Nagato, even Minato in his own way. He'd never learned to let go, never stopped carrying the weight of their choices. It's what I should have done, he said finally. It's what I'm trying to teach you to do. Do you hear that, Kit? He wants to teach you to abandon those you care about. To accept their loss and move on to more convenient relationships. How very like them, to disguise callousness as wisdom. Maybe I don't want to learn that lesson, Naruto said quietly. Maybe I don't want to become the kind of person who gives up on people. It's not giving up, it's what? Naruto's voice carried an edge that made Jiraiya straighten in his swing. It's being practical. It's being realistic. It's accepting that some people aren't worth the effort. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Naruto stood abruptly, his swing swaying empty behind him. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're telling me to stop caring about the people who matter most to me. To accept their loss as inevitable and focus on being a better weapon for the people who sent me to fail in the first place. Jiraiya blinked at the venom in his student's voice. This wasn't the Naruto he knew, the boy who never gave up, who insisted on believing in people even when they didn't deserve it. This version was harder, more cynical, more willing to see ill intent in good advice. Naruto, listen to me. The Nine Tails chakra, it can influence your emotions, make you more aggressive, more paranoid. I think that's what's happening here. And there it is, Kit. When faced with your legitimate anger, your justified resentment, your reasonable questions, he blames me. As if your ability to think clearly were somehow my corruption rather than your growth. Don't, Naruto said, his voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. Don't you dare blame the fox for this. My feelings are my own. The fox. Jiraiya's eyes sharpened. You're talking to it. Directly. We have conversations sometimes. So what? So what? Jiraiya was on his feet now, his casual demeanor replaced by genuine alarm. Naruto, that thing is not your friend. It's a demon of pure malice and hatred, sealed inside you to prevent it from destroying everything you care about. If it's talking to you, influencing your thoughts, it's not influencing anything. The words came out louder than Naruto had intended, sharp enough to make several birds take flight from nearby trees. It's listening to me. It's the only thing in this village that actually listens to me without trying to tell me how I should feel or what I should think or who I should be willing to sacrifice." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them wanted to examine. Jiraiya stared at his student, seeing something in those blue eyes that made his chest tight with growing dread. "Naruto," he said carefully, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Nine Tails is not your friend. It doesn't care about your well-being or your feelings. Everything it tells you is designed to isolate you from the people who actually care about you, to make you distrust the bonds that keep you human. And what if those bonds were never real to begin with?" Naruto asked. "What if the people who actually care about me only care about what I can do for them? That's not true, isn't it?" Naruto began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. "Name one person in this village who values me as a person rather than as a weapon. One person who's shown genuine interest in my well-being rather than my combat effectiveness. One person who's ever asked what I want instead of telling me what I should want." Jiraiya opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Because when he tried to think of examples, the list was disturbingly short. Even his own relationship with Naruto was built around training and missions and preparing him for greater challenges. When was the last time they'd simply talked about Naruto's hopes and dreams and fears without it being connected to his role as a ninja? Silence speaks volumes, doesn't it, Kit? Even he cannot deny the truth of what you've observed. "The village needs you," Jiraiya said finally, falling back on larger justifications when personal ones failed him. "You're important too. The village needs the Nine Tails," Naruto corrected. "I'm just the container it happens to be stuck in." "That's not true. You're special, Naruto. You're the child of prophecy." The words were meant to be encouraging, inspiring, a reminder of Naruto's greater destiny. Instead, they had exactly the opposite effect. Naruto stopped pacing and turned to stare at his mentor with an expression that was part disbelief, part bitter amusement. "The child of prophecy," he repeated. "Is that supposed to make me feel better? It should make you understand how important you are. The prophecy speaks of a student who will either bring peace to the world or destroy it utterly. You have the power to do what other people expect me to do," Naruto finished. "To fulfill a destiny that someone else wrote for me, to be the hero or villain that the story requires, to shape my entire life around meeting the expectations of a prediction I had no part in creating." Jiraiya frowned. This wasn't how Naruto was supposed to react to learning about his prophetic importance. He should have been excited, honored, eager to live up to his destiny. "The prophecy is a gift," Jiraiya said. "It means you're chosen for something greater than. It's another leash." Naruto's voice was flat, certain. "Another way to control me, to make sure I do what you want me to do instead of what I want to do. First, I'm the Nine Tails container who has to stay loyal to protect the village. Then I'm the failed teammate who has to prove himself by bringing back Sasuke. Now I'm the prophetic child who has to save or damn the entire world according to someone else's vision." He speaks of prophecies while ignoring your pain, Kit. He offers you grand destinies while dismissing your simple need for acceptance and understanding. Do you see how they operate? Always the larger picture, never the individual cost. "When do I get to choose?" Naruto asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Jiraiya want to step back. "When do I get to decide what I want my life to be instead of having it decided for me by village needs and prophetic requirements and other people's expectations?" "Naruto, you're letting the fox poison your thoughts. Stop blaming the fox." The shout echoed across the empty playground. "Stop dismissing everything I think and feel as demonic corruption. Maybe, just maybe, I'm capable of having my own thoughts about my own life." Jiraiya held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not trying to dismiss your feelings. I'm trying to help you understand that the Nine Tails. The Nine Tails is the only thing in this village that acknowledges my feelings exist, Naruto said. It doesn't tell me how I should feel about being treated like a weapon. It doesn't explain why I should be grateful for scraps of acceptance. It doesn't promise me that things will get better if I just keep being the perfect little soldier. And what does it tell you instead? The question hung between them like a challenge. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft enough that Jiraiya had to strain to hear it. It tells me the truth. That I've spent my entire life trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely. That I've been fighting for people who see me as a tool rather than a person. That maybe it's time to stop caring more about their approval than they care about my well-being. Wise words, Kit. You are learning to see clearly at last. Jiraiya felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or temporary disillusionment. This was his student beginning to question the fundamental assumptions that kept him loyal to Konoha, that kept him fighting for others rather than himself. The village made mistakes, he said carefully. But that doesn't mean. It means exactly what it means, Naruto interrupted. And what it means is that maybe I should stop making their problems my problems. Maybe I should start thinking about what I want instead of what they need. And what do you want? It should have been a simple question. But as Naruto stood there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of his lonely childhood, he realized he couldn't answer it. He'd spent so many years focused on gaining acceptance, proving his worth, earning his place in the village that he'd never stopped to consider what he actually wanted from his life. All he knew for certain was that it wasn't this. It wasn't being the perfect weapon, the prophetic savior, the loyal ninja who bled for people who would never truly accept him. It wasn't carrying everyone else's burdens while being denied the simple human connections that made those burdens bearable. I don't know, he said finally. But I know it's not what I have now. The first step toward freedom, Kit. Admitting that your current path leads nowhere you want to go. Jiraiya saw the danger in that admission, saw the way his student was pulling back from everything that had once motivated him. But instead of addressing the underlying pain, instead of acknowledging the legitimate grievances that were driving Naruto toward isolation, he did what shinobi were trained to do. He focused on containing the threat. We need to work on your seal, he said. Strengthen the barriers between you and the Nine Tails. If it's influencing your thoughts to this degree. It's not influencing my thoughts, Naruto said tiredly. It's just the only thing willing to validate them. Naruto, listen to me. The prophecy. The prophecy can go to hell. The words were said quietly, without heat, but they hit Jiraiya like a physical blow. I'm not anyone's chosen child. I'm not anyone's weapon. I'm not anyone's savior. I'm just Naruto, and maybe that should be enough. He turned and began walking away from the playground, leaving Jiraiya standing alone among the empty swings. Where are you going? Jiraiya called after him. Home, Naruto replied without turning around. To think about things. As his student disappeared into the maze of Konoha streets, Jiraiya remained standing in the gathering darkness, a growing certainty settling in his chest like a weight. He was losing him. The boy who had once embodied hope and determination and unshakable faith in the power of bonds was walking away, and Jiraiya had no idea how to bring him back. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that his own approach, focusing on power and prophecy and greater purpose while ignoring the basic human needs that drove everything else, had played a role in pushing Naruto away in the first place. First consideration of leaving, the report would later say. Subject displaying increasing alienation from support structures and mentor figures. Emotional bonds weakening rapidly. Recommend immediate intervention. But by the time that report was written, it would already be too late. In his small apartment, Naruto sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling, Jiraiya's words echoing in his mind. The child of prophecy. Chosen for greatness or destruction. Another burden, another expectation, another reason why his life belonged to other people rather than himself. For the first time since returning to Konoha, he seriously considered what it would be like to simply leave. To walk away from the village, the expectations, the prophecies, and all the people who saw him as anything other than just Naruto. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first honest idea he'd had in years. Yes, Kit, let that thought grow. Let it take root. There is a whole world beyond these walls, beyond their narrow vision of what you should be. Perhaps it's time you explored it. For once, Naruto didn't argue with the fox's suggestion. The training ground where Team 7 had once learned to work together felt like a graveyard. Naruto arrived exactly on time for what Kakashi had optimistically called a team meeting, though everyone knew it was really an intervention disguised as training. The copy ninja had been making increasingly desperate attempts to restore some semblance of their old dynamic, sending messages to both surviving members of Team 7 with requests that felt more like pleas. Sakura was already there, standing near the memorial stone with her arms crossed and her pink hair catching the morning light. She looked up when Naruto approached, and the expression on her face made his steps falter. Where there had once been warmth, concern, even the familiar exasperation of dealing with his antics, there was now something cold and accusatory that made his chest tight. "You're late," she said, though he wasn't. "I'm exactly on time," Naruto replied, settling into a defensive posture without thinking about it. "Are you? Because it feels like you've been late for everything that mattered for months now." The words hit like a slap, precise and designed to wound. This wasn't the Sakura who used to scold him for being loud or punch him for saying something stupid. This was someone else wearing her face. Someone harder, angrier, looking for someone to blame for a loss that was eating her alive. Listen to the venom in her voice, Kit. This is the same girl you once claimed to love, now speaking to you as if you were the enemy. Kakashi arrived a few minutes later, his usual tardiness somehow making the tension in the air even thicker. He took one look at the way Naruto and Sakura were positioned, carefully maintaining distance, avoiding eye contact, radiating hostility, and Naruto saw something die in his visible eye. "Right," Kakashi said with forced cheer. "I thought we could do some basic coordination exercises. Nothing too strenuous, just." "Why?" Sakura's voice cut through his attempt at normalcy like a blade. "What's the point of coordination exercises when we're not actually a team anymore?" "We're a team," Kakashi insisted. "We've always been a team, even when one of us abandons the village to join a psychopathic snake." Sakura's green eyes flashed as she turned to stare directly at Naruto. "Even when another one fails so completely to stop him that we have to accept he's never coming back." "Sakura-chan," Naruto said quietly, "that's not fair." "Not fair." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and grief and rage that had been building for weeks. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that Sasuke is gone? Is it fair that he's probably dead in some laboratory while that monster experiments on him? Is it fair that the person who promised to bring him back came home empty-handed and beaten half to death?" Each question was a knife twisted in wounds that were still bleeding. Naruto felt himself taking a step back, then another, as if physical distance could somehow protect him from the fury in her voice. "I tried," he said, and hated how small his voice sounded. "I gave everything I had. Did you?" Sakura stepped closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you couldn't even last 5 minutes in a real fight with him. It looked like all your big talk about bringing him home was just that, talk. She blames you for her own weakness, Kit." She stood by and watched as Sasuke walked into darkness, did nothing to prevent his corruption, offered no alternatives to his thirst for power. And now she makes her failure your burden to carry. I fought him, Naruto said, his own anger beginning to rise. I bled for him. I nearly died trying to knock some sense into him. What did you do, Sakura-chan? Besides stand there and let him walk away. The slap came fast and hard, rocking his head to the side and leaving his cheek stinging. But it was the look in Sakura's eyes that really hurt, pure hatred, as if he were personally responsible for every bad thing that had happened to Team 7. Enough. Kakashi stepped between them, his voice carrying the authority of command. Both of you, stop this. Now. Stop what? Sakura's voice was high and tight with barely controlled hysteria. Stop telling the truth. Stop acknowledging that Naruto failed in the one thing that mattered most. Stop pretending that everything is fine when our teammate is gone and it's his fault. It's not his fault, Kakashi said firmly. Sasuke made his choice. No one could have. Anyone else could have done better. Sakura whirled on their sensei, her training temporarily forgotten in the face of her grief. Rock Lee would have done better. Neji would have done better. Hell, even Kiba would have done better because at least he wouldn't have held back. Held back? Naruto's voice was dangerous now, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. You think I held back? I think you were more worried about not hurting your precious Sasuke than you were about actually stopping him, Sakura shot back. I think you cared more about maintaining your stupid rivalry than about bringing him home to the people who actually loved him. Do you hear her, Kit? She speaks of love while showering you with hatred. She speaks of failure while having contributed nothing to the solution herself. This is how they repay loyalty, with blame and accusation and demands that you bear the weight of their inadequacy. You want to know why I held back? Naruto's voice was rising now, his control slipping as weeks of suppressed pain and anger finally found a target. Because I still believed he was worth saving. Because I still thought there was good in him. Because I was stupid enough to think that bonds meant something. Bonds? Sakura laughed bitterly. What bonds? The bonds that let him put a Chidori through your chest. The bonds that made him choose power over friendship. The bonds that meant so little to him that he walked away without a second thought. The bonds that made me fight for him even when he was trying to kill me. Naruto shouted. The bonds that made me bleed and suffer and nearly die because I thought he was worth it. The bonds that apparently meant more to me than they did to anyone else on this team. If they meant so much to you, then why is he gone? Sakura's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than any scream. If you cared so much, if you tried so hard, if you gave everything you had, then why are we standing here without him? The question hung in the air like a curse, unanswerable and devastating. Because the horrible truth was that Naruto didn't know. He'd replayed that fight at the Valley of the End 1,000 times, analyzing every moment, every choice, every word spoken between them. And he still couldn't identify the crucial moment where everything went wrong, the key decision that might have changed the outcome. All he knew was that he'd failed, and Sasuke was gone, and now even the people who should have understood his loss were turning their pain into weapons against him. That's enough, Kakashi said again, but his voice lacked conviction now. Even he seemed shaken by the venom in Sakura's words, the complete breakdown of anything resembling team cohesion. No, it's not enough, Sakura continued, her gaze never leaving Naruto's face. It's not nearly enough. Because Sasuke is still gone, and Orochimaru still has him, and we're still sitting here pretending that everything is fine when our team is broken beyond repair. Maybe, Naruto said quietly, it was broken long before Sasuke left. The words came out without conscious thought, but once spoken, they felt true in a way that made his chest ache. Because looking back at their time as Team 7, how much of their supposed bond had been real? How much had been genuine friendship versus proximity and shared experiences? How much had been actual caring versus the kind of casual affection that develops between people who spend time together? Sasuke had walked away from all of it without apparent regret. Sakura was standing here blaming him for losses that belonged to all of them. Kakashi was trying to force them back into patterns that had never been as strong as they'd pretended. Maybe the bonds he'd believed in so desperately had always been more illusion than reality. Now you begin to see, Kit. The connections you treasured were chains they used to bind you to their expectations. When those connections no longer serve their purpose, they discard them without hesitation. But they expect you to remain loyal to bonds they've already abandoned. What's that supposed to mean? Sakura demanded. It means maybe we were never as close as we pretended to be, Naruto said, his voice growing steadier as a strange calm settled over him. Maybe we were just three kids thrown together by circumstance, telling ourselves we were a family because it was easier than admitting we were strangers. That's not true, Kakashi protested. You three were. Were what? Naruto turned to look at his sensei directly. A team. When did we ever actually work as a team? Sasuke did his thing. Sakura supported whatever Sasuke wanted to do, and I tagged along making noise and hoping someone would notice me. That's not a team, that's a comedy act with delusions of significance. You're being unfair, Sakura said, but there was less heat in her voice now, as if some part of her recognized the truth in his assessment. Am I? Tell me, Sakura-chan, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not how my training was going, not whether I was getting stronger, not if I was ready for the next mission. When was the last time you cared about me as a person instead of as Sasuke's rival or the team's loudmouth? The silence that followed was damning in its completeness. Because the honest answer was never. Even during their closest moments, even when she'd been concerned about his injuries or proud of his accomplishments, it had always been in the context of his role on the team rather than genuine interest in his well-being. And you, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto continued, his gaze shifting to their instructor. When was the last time you treated me like a student instead of a project? When was the last time you taught me something because you thought I'd benefit from it, instead of because it served some larger strategic purpose? Kakashi opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Because the uncomfortable truth was that his relationship with Naruto had always been defined by external factors, controlling the Nine Tails, preparing for greater threats, managing the boy's emotional state to maintain his loyalty to the village. He'd never simply been Naruto's teacher in the way he'd been Sasuke's. This is what the Nine Tails is doing to you, Kakashi said finally, falling back on familiar explanations. It's making you paranoid, making you see enemies where there are friends. Stop. The word came out sharp enough to make both of his former teammates flinch. Stop blaming the fox for things you don't want to hear. Stop dismissing every criticism as demonic corruption. Stop refusing to examine your own actions by claiming that any negative reaction to them must be supernatural manipulation. They cannot bear to look at themselves honestly, Kit. It is easier to paint you as corrupted than to admit they have failed you as teammates, as friends, as family. The Nine Tails is influencing you, Sakura insisted. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, Naruto said. I'm seeing things as they actually are instead of how I wished they were. And what I see is that the bonds I thought we shared were always more important to me than they were to either of you. He began walking away from the training ground, from the memorial stone, from the sight of so many supposed victories that felt hollow in retrospect. Where are you going? Kakashi called after him. Somewhere else, Naruto replied without turning around. Somewhere I don't have to pretend that broken things can be fixed with good intentions and team building exercises. Naruto. Wait. But he was already gone, leaving behind two people who had once meant everything to him and now felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. That evening, Naruto found himself at Ichiraku Ramen, seeking comfort in the one place that had never demanded anything from him except payment for food. Tsuki served him his usual with a smile that was warm but worried, clearly sensing something different in his most loyal customer. Everything all right, Naruto? The old man asked as he ladled broth into a bowl. It was such a simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than ulterior motive. The kind of basic human consideration that should have been commonplace but felt precious in its rarity. Just thinking about things, Naruto replied, accepting the bowl gratefully. Heavy thoughts, from the look of it. Naruto nodded, taking a sip of the familiar broth and feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Tsuki-san, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think people can change? Really change, I mean. Not just get stronger or learn new skills, but fundamentally become someone different. The ramen chef was quiet for a moment, wiping down his counter while he considered the question. I think people can become who they really are, he said finally. Sometimes we spend years being who we think others want us to be, or who we think we should be. But eventually, if we're lucky, we get the chance to discover who we actually are underneath all those expectations. Wisdom from an unexpected source, Kit. Perhaps this is what you've been missing. Not the grand pronouncements of prophecy and destiny, but simple truth from someone who asks nothing of you except the price of a bowl of noodles. And what if who you really are isn't who people want you to be? Naruto asked. Tsuki smiled, and there was sadness in it, the kind that came from personal experience rather than abstract sympathy. Then you have a choice to make, he said. You can keep pretending to be someone else for their comfort, or you can be honest about who you are and deal with the consequences. Neither choice is easy, but only one of them lets you live with yourself. Naruto finished his ramen in contemplative silence, paying for his meal and leaving a generous tip. As he prepared to leave, Tsuki caught his arm gently. For what it's worth, the old man said quietly, I've always liked who you actually are, Naruto. Not the ninja, not the hero, not the vessel for great power, just the boy who sits at my counter and talks about his day. Don't let anyone convince you that person isn't worth being. Outside, walking through streets that felt less like home with each passing day, Naruto carried those words like a small flame against the growing darkness in his heart. One person, at least, had seen him clearly and found him acceptable. It was more than he could say for the teammates who had once sworn to stand beside him no matter what. One honest voice among a chorus of lies and expectations, Kit. Remember this feeling, the relief of being accepted without condition, valued without requirement. Remember it, and ask yourself why it should be so rare in your life. As he made his way back to his empty apartment, Naruto found himself thinking less about Team 7 and more about the possibility of finding other people, other places, where simple acceptance might be the rule rather than the miraculous exception. The thought didn't terrify him anymore. If anything, it felt like hope. The festival of the autumn moon had always been Naruto's least favorite time of year. It wasn't the celebration itself that bothered him, the paper lanterns strung between buildings, the smell of grilled food wafting through the streets, the sound of laughter and music that turned all of Konoha into one giant party. Under different circumstances, he might have loved the warmth and community spirit that transformed his village into something magical. But those circumstances had never existed for him. Standing at the edge of the main festival square, watching families share meals and friends toast each other's health and couples dance under the starlight, Naruto felt like a ghost haunting someone else's celebration. He was physically present but fundamentally separate, able to observe but never truly participate in the joy surrounding him. Look at them, Kit. See how easily they forget the blood you've shed in their service, the pain you've endured for their safety. Tonight they feast and dance while you stand alone in the shadows, invisible despite everything you've sacrificed for their happiness. Kurama's voice had become a constant presence over the past weeks, offering commentary that grew more persuasive with each passing day. The fox was right, as it so often was. These people lived their lives in blissful ignorance of the cost of their peace, content to enjoy the benefits of his protection while denying him even basic inclusion in their community. Naruto pulled his hood up and moved deeper into the crowd, hoping that anonymity might make the isolation more bearable. For a while, it worked. Lost among the festival goers, he could almost pretend he belonged here, that the laughter and warmth extended to him as well. That illusion shattered the moment someone recognized him. As that, a woman's voice, sharp with sudden alarm. The Uzumaki boy, her companion confirmed. What's he doing here? The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, and suddenly there was space around him that hadn't existed moments before. Not obvious enough to be called outright exclusion, but unmistakable in its intent, a bubble of discomfort that marked him as unwelcome in his own village's celebration. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the performances and food stalls and traditional games. But everywhere he went, conversations died when he approached and resumed in hushed tones after he passed. Children who had been playing loudly fell silent when their parents noticed his presence. Merchants who had been calling out their wares suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. They tolerate your presence because they must, but they will never truly accept you. You are the reminder of their own vulnerability, the living proof that their peace rests on foundations they'd rather not examine. Near the center of the square, a group of older villagers had gathered around a makeshift shrine, offering prayers for the continued prosperity and safety of Konoha. Naruto found himself drifting toward them, drawn by some masochistic impulse to hear what blessings they asked for their village. Protect us from those who would harm our children. Keep the demons at bay. Grant us peace in these troubled times. Standard prayers, the kind offered at every festival. But as he drew closer, the conversation shifted from formal supplication to more casual discussion. Hard to believe it's been 2 months since the Uchiha boy left, one of them was saying. Tragic loss, another agreed. Such potential, wasted on revenge. The village isn't the same without him. He could have been one of our greatest protectors. Instead, we're left with. The speaker's voice dropped to a whisper, but Naruto's enhanced hearing caught every word. Well, let's just say the quality of our remaining young ninja leaves something to be desired. Listen carefully, Kit. Hear how they speak of the one who abandoned them versus the one who has never wavered in his loyalty. Don't say that too loudly, someone else cautioned. You know how sensitive the Hokage is about certain topics. Sensitive or not, it's the truth. The Uchiha was clan nobility, a prodigy who could have restored his bloodline and strengthened the village immeasurably. Instead, we're stuck with another meaningful pause. Less desirable alternatives. Naruto's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he remained hidden in the shadows, morbidly compelled to hear more. The mission to retrieve him was a disaster, continued the first speaker. Good ninja injured, resources wasted, and for what? So that boy could prove he's as useless as we always suspected. Should never have sent him in the first place. Everyone knows he's more liability than asset. The demon's influence, most likely. Probably sabotaged the mission deliberately, couldn't stand the thought of the village getting its precious Uchiha back. The words hit like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. These people, his people, the ones he'd sworn to protect, genuinely believed he had deliberately failed to save Sasuke. They thought his inability to bring back his teammate was born of malice rather than inadequacy. Do you hear them, Kit? This is what they truly think of you. Not just incompetence, but active sabotage. Not just failure, but betrayal. They would rather believe you evil than admit that their golden Uchiha chose darkness willingly. Honestly, one of the villagers continued, the village might be better off if positions were reversed. If the demon container had been the one to leave, we'd still have the Uchiha's abilities without the constant threat of other problems. Don't speak like that, someone protested weakly. The boy has served the village faithfully. Has he? Or has he simply been following orders because he had no choice? Mark my words, the moment he decides his leash is too tight, we'll see his true nature. And it won't be pretty. At least the Uchiha's betrayal was honest. Clean. He wanted power and went where he could find it. But that one. The speaker gestured vaguely in Naruto's direction, though they couldn't see him in the shadows. That one pretends loyalty while carrying the seed of our destruction. I'd rather face an honest enemy than a false friend. Shish. Lower your voices. Why? It's not like anyone disagrees. Half the village thinks the same thing, we just can't say it openly. Sometimes I wonder if we wouldn't have been better off if he'd died in that fight at the valley. Then at least we'd only have one problem to worry about instead of two. The conversation continued, but Naruto could no longer process the words. The blood rushing in his ears drowned out everything else except the pounding of his own heartbeat and the voice that had become his most constant companion.